May I have your attention, please? Let's get started. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodge, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is Ms. Skila Harris. Skila is a director for the Tennessee Valley Authority. She received a BS in Political Science from Western Kentucky University in 1973, and an MS in Legislative Affairs from George Washington University in 1977. She has worked in several engineering and management consulting firms that specialize in energy. She was with DOE during the Carter and the Clinton administrations. She was also vice president of a scrap iron and metal company. In fact, this is a quote that she gave me just a few moments ago. She's the only person in history who has gone directly from a scrap iron company to the White House. She served, when she went to the White House, she served as a special assistant to Vice President Al Gore, and later on as chief of staff for Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore. She joined the TVA board in 1999, and she will be a member of the new board. They've gone from a 3-member board, as most of you know, to a 9-member board, and she'll be on the new 9-member board until the year 2008. Her topic today is, and I quote, "My Recipe for Energy Policy." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Skila Harris.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very flattered to be here today because I've looked at some of your other speakers and their topics, and it was pretty daunting, actually. Some of those topics have been covered, so I will try to elevate my intellectual level and talk to you about something that has been very near and dear to my heart for years, which is energy policy and exactly how it happens. But I want to begin by complimenting and congratulating those of you in this room who have chosen nuclear engineering as your field of study and hopefully your profession. You actually made a courageous decision because until recently, support for nuclear power has been lukewarm, to say the least. And but now the industry is alive with opportunity, with prospects being discussed at the highest level of business and government about new and exciting things for the future. So I think that your decision, whenever it was made, maybe a couple of years ago, makes you look really wise given the developments, and I think that you might even be considered prescient in your choice of careers and study. Don't you think so? I also have good news to tell you because TVA and other utilities around the world and other research institutions are all very much in need of fresh talent to replace some of their older employees. And so I am very confident that each and every one of you are going to be able to find exciting career paths, and you're going to have very challenging work before you. You know, the nuclear energy industry has either been riding high, like it was in the late 70s, or it's been laying low, like it has been since 3 Mile Island in 1979. Clearly, it's a cyclical industry, but during the same period of time, our overall national energy policy has also gone through its own twists and turns, and it's also responded to market trends, political whims, as well as some really stern realities. So today I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming through the recent history of our national energy policy, where it stands today and where I think it should be, and help maybe you look at what may help shape your future and your career. Following the food metaphor of the recipe, now on to the main course. Energy is absolutely essential for work, whether it's human energy, whether it's horsepower, whether it's energy created and generated by nuclear, fossil, hydro, wind, solar. We have to have energy just to exist. But it's not surprising that given the generically lazy attitude of humans, that we have been incredibly innovative in figuring out how to get energy from other sources so we don't have to do the work ourselves. And to give you a little background, according to the Energy Information Agency, in the early 1600s through about the mid 1800s, the number one fuel in this country was wood. Now, that worked quite well for a little while, but then suddenly we decided that coal should replace wood. So around 1850, our country shifted from using wood to coal. Almost exactly at the same time, petroleum became an energy supply. Now, petroleum really remained second to king coal until the automobile became affordable. And once the automobile became affordable, guess what? Petroleum demand went straight up, and it has stayed in the number one spot of energy sources since that time. And it continues, and for the foreseeable future, I think it will continue to be the fuel that we use most. Now, natural gas came pretty soon after petroleum, but natural gas has always hung right below petroleum on the demand curve. So even today, natural gas is our number two fuel source. Along the time, hydro and nuclear energy has also contributed to this country's fuel mix. Now, energy consumption grew. As energy consumption grew, coal, oil, and other energy industries became very powerful and very influential in this country. And they became very influential in an important area, which is policy related to energy. In fact, for the most part, it was industry and discoveries and innovation that really made the choices for us in terms of energy until a very important event. And that event was World War I. World War I changed the way the world looked at energy. And a lot of that was because suddenly we had to focus our resources on providing coal for the ships, for the factories. We had to provide fuel, petroleum for jeeps and trucks and airplanes. So suddenly this demand that was so focused required the government to allocate energy sources and to sometimes ration them even. And that was, to me, a sea change in how energy has been dealt with by our government. In fact, in 1917, Woodrow Wilson created the Fuel Administration. I think, in my study of this, was probably the first energy-related agency that the federal government had. And it was somewhat successful in helping the country shift its priorities and provide the fuel for the engine of war. So I think this is a good point to start the energy policy story. With the government's efforts to create a rational approach for guaranteeing adequate supplies of energy to support our health, to support safety, our economy, and our national security. And generally, that's still what our government does today. Now, the early history, which is of energy policy, which I count from World War I until the early 70s, is really a fascinating story. And I encourage you all to read some of the books if you're interested, if you have any interest at all, because some of the books help us understand what we're doing today and some of the events that are influencing so much today. There's some really good stories in it, and I actually think that they could probably make a TV reality series after some of the stories. Let me just give you a taste for it. There was a time in this world when a group known as the Seven Sisters, which in fact were the 7 largest oil companies, basically drove everything related to energy policy throughout the world. The story of the Seven Sisters is an amazing story. It was this period also between World War I and 1970 that TVA was created, the place where I work. That was an important time in our history because it was a new level of government intervention in energy policy and as well as resource planning. Also during this time, in 1944, the very first Synthetic Fuels Act was created. And I'm going to link back to that pretty often through this because there's some themes that have been discussed since day one in energy policy to as recently as last week in George Bush's State of the Union address. Now, there was also President Eisenhower's imposition of oil import quotas. We've tried just about everything in energy policy in the U.S. And what we've discovered is some things work and some things don't. I hate to say that President Eisenhower's mandatory oil import quotas was probably a really bad idea. But he did it and we learned a lesson from it. Also, what happened during this time that still has huge implications for us today is the birth of OPEC. This is basically a cartel of oil companies and oil producing nations that really has tremendous influence on our government's policies even to this day. And then in that period of time, it was one of the first 1967 Arab-Israeli war. What you will see that war in the Middle East continues to today to influence our energy policy. You know, it's been fascinating because the roots of our dependency on oil today started during that period of time. The lack of stability in the Middle East started in great part in that period of time. The roots of terrorism really were born in that period. We first began to realize the environmental impacts of energy extraction and use during that period. And the list goes on and on. So I'm a great believer, if you want to understand what's happening today, you've got to understand where it came from. But today I'm going to fast forward through and I'm going to start the story about energy policy in 1973. Now, I select 1973 because in that year, a group of oil-producing nations dramatically reduced the amount of oil they were producing. And as a result, it created an international crisis, one that had very unique impact on the United States. It also happened to be my first year living and working in Washington, D.C. as a very, very lowly energy analyst. And I have to say, it has given me a great seat to watch how policy has progressed over the years. Richard Nixon was president when the 1973 Arab oil embargo took place. But at the same time, that crisis, President Nixon was experiencing, to say politely, a crisis of his own. And he was struggling and I think to somewhat distracted by his own political problems. But however, prior to the emergence, the public emergence of his political issues with Watergate, President Nixon actually really came up with some great ideas related to energy. He recognized that there was a crisis looming ahead. He called on Congress to take action to fend off the approaching supply and price spikes that he saw coming. And he saw that disruptions were almost inevitable. Well, the signals didn't just come from saber rattling in the Middle East. About the same time that he knew that there was a war brewing, there were brownouts in California on the electricity system. So there were signals here in the United States that we had a problem with our supply of energy then, and that there was something wrong with our distribution policies and our supplying policies. But finally, even though the crisis came, the Arab oil embargo was initiated, and after Nixon tried very hard to rally both public and congressional support, Congress wouldn't listen, and he did not have public support. So all the good ideas he proposed were actually for naught. Let me just give you a few of his ideas, because in a little bit I'm going to give a critique on the different presidents' energy policy. President Nixon, as early as the early 70s, called on EPA to demonstrate technology to control sulfur dioxide out of coal plant emissions. That was over 30 years ago, but he knew at that time it was going to be a problem. He also supported funding for coal gasification, for coal liquefaction, and one of my favorite technology, magnetohydrodynamics, which you never hear about anymore, but in the 70s it was really a hot topic and great cocktail chatter. Solar and advanced nuclear technology is something that Nixon supported. All of these things, plus what I hold dear to my heart, he called for increased energy efficiency. Well, he had great ideas, but unfortunately, he had no support. Part of that was of his own making, but part of it was just the country and Congress were not ready to bite the bullet. Another problem that Nixon had, which has been a chronic problem for the federal government, is energy bureaucracy was totally dysfunctional in the government. Every single government agency had somebody doing energy policy, and you just needed a more consolidated effort. So given his dilemma of no congressional support and this dysfunctional agency, Nixon decided that he was going to run energy policy out of the Oval Office. This is unheard of, but that's how important it was to him. Well, what he did is he tried to use his existing powers. So he used executive orders to suspend President Eisenhower's, his old boss's, mandatory oil import quotas. Most people were delirious. They said, good for you, you know what you're doing. Then, because he was nervous that inflation was going to go up as prices went up, he imposed price controls. I mean, this was just a completely counteraction. He had done one good thing and then he countered it with another by putting price controls on. But I can tell you this switch of this ambivalence about what actually to do is very typical of our energy policy over the years. So in the middle of these efforts, OPEC finally implemented the full embargo, and the world supply of petroleum was in a total turmoil. As a result, prices went from $3 a barrel, can you believe it was ever $3 a barrel, to $11 a barrel, and they were complaining. They should see it today. And the full extent of the U.S.'s vulnerability to supply and interruptions and price spikes was made evident. I mean, if you didn't think we were vulnerable, you knew it after that moment. Finally, this supply disruption and high prices turned up the political heat. So, as you can imagine, Congress thinks they're going to lose votes, so they get going. And they actually passed 2 pieces of legislation. They were not consequential, though. They really were not the type of legislative action you would hope for. And as a matter of fact, Nixon even vetoed one of them because they had put some stuff in it that he felt would have been a disincentive for energy self-sufficiency. Well, by the summer of '74, Nixon was gone. resigning before he was impeached, and then President Gerald Ford took over. And he assumed responsibility for what was the centerpiece of the Nixon program, something called Project Independence. The whole idea was that we should become independent of any other source and that we should be self-sufficient in terms of energy supply. Well, Congress started passing legislation. In an effort to rationalize that government bureaucracy, they also approved programs like for the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. I'm sure that you all have heard that discussed as one of the options. So they really started trying to make some sense of our energy policy. They increased funding for energy research and development, which was a very positive thing. They established new incentives for energy conservation. And they set in motion some pretty important regulatory changes for how the government regulates industry. However, in a classic move, and this happens over and over, but not quite in such an obvious way, President Ford, who had pounded his bully pulpit calling for energy independence, suddenly decided when the supply started loosening and things got a little bit better, he decided instead of energy independence, we should have reasonable self-sufficiency. I mean, he wimped out in my book because this is a problem in terms of people not having the political will to do what really was the right thing. So this was definitely a departure from what the country really needed. So after Gerald Ford went to this polite, reasonable self-sufficiency, Jimmy Carter was elected in 1979. In great reaction, part of it was in response to the Watergate scandal. But they also elected him because he was a person who understood energy. You know, he was a nuke. He had graduated from Annapolis. He had an engineering degree. And people had confidence because he really talked about energy in a great and an expansive way. So he was elected and he came to office calling the energy crisis the moral equivalent of war. And I worked for the man at the Department of Energy. I have to say, just as he perceived the energy crisis as the moral equivalent of war, he saw that as war is a function of government, so should energy be. He was much more aggressive. His policies were much more aggressive in terms of government intervention. And he believed that the government should play a very substantial role in defining how we use, how we produce, and how we think about energy. Right or wrong, Carter's proposal to address the country's energy supply and price vulnerability were bold. But I have to tell you, in reality, they were not as bold as what Nixon and Ford had presented in their energy plans. Carter incorporated all of his views in what is known as the very first National Energy Plan. Every year, every 4 years, a national energy plan is produced. And when you hear people say, we don't have an energy plan for this nation, that's wrong. We get one every 4 years. It's just that nobody listens or nobody follows the National Energy Plan. So, I mean, that's a whole different animal when you realize that every administration has one since Carter has developed one. Carter's National Energy Plan set forth really big ideas. And some people considered that those ideas were predicated on a pretty paranoid view of the industry. And I have to tell you, the man who was very instrumental in creating the Carter Energy Plan subsequently came to the Tennessee Valley Authority and served as our chairman, S. David Freeman. So our paths have crossed twice in my career. Now, I have to say, the mood in Capitol Hill, even though by the time Carter was elected, the pressure was really off in terms of the crisis mode. Congress was ready to act. And it followed Carter's lead, and it started enacting legislation. And I mean, it passed act after act. Let me just list a few of them. The National Energy Act of 1978, the Power Plant Industrial Fuel Use Act, the Public Utilities Regulation Policy Act, the Energy Act. Man, Congress was on a roll. You know, anything that came up there, they passed. Good, bad, or ugly. Some of the things that I have to highlight in terms that came through all those pieces of legislation, was the creation of the Department of Energy. You know, that was one of the best parts of that is it gave me a job. The prohibition of the use of oil and natural gas for electric generation. Now, that's interesting. It prohibited the use of natural gas and oil to generate electricity. We'll return to that later. It established energy efficiency standards for appliances. Those are still in place today, and actually they have done remarkable things for improving efficiency. It continued wellhead price controls. It partially decontrolled natural gas, which is now completely decontrolled. It created incentives for ethanol production, which are still around today. It established incentives for the use of solar collectors on residential units, established penalties for gas guzzlers. Now, we have definitely moved away from that, but it's being talked about again today. The requirement for utilities to purchase power from renewable resources, and hundreds of other provisions. You know, this is how I was making my living at that time. Every time they passed legislation, it was my job to be the interpreter of what that would mean to you as an engineering, a customer of our engineering company, or to somebody else. That was my job. But even with this frenzy of legislation, you would have thought that we would have gotten some solutions out of it. Well, guess what? Iran was in the middle of a revolution. Once again, turmoil in the Middle East. And in the chaos that resulted from that, limited the production of oil from Iran. It went down about 3 million barrels per day, and it caused a huge disruption in the international oil market. The response in the United States was starting in California and working across the country. There were gas lines. I mean, the big deal during that period of time was, how were you going to get your gasoline? You know, you would have to wait in line. There were fist fights. There was bad behavior. It was not a good time, and it was an ugly time here in the United States. It was in this environment of the crisis that Jimmy Carter presented his second national energy policy. Again, its scope was very expansive, but I have to say there weren't a lot of new ideas in it, because by the time you had gone through Nixon, Ford, and Carter in his first energy plan, basically the waterfront had been covered. It was really, there were no big new ideas coming out of it. Again, Congress responded because they were trying to keep their jobs. And so what they did is they passed some of the major provisions. One provision was they passed the windfall profits tax. And I know that you may have heard recently, as the earnings for the large oil companies came out, there's been renewed discussion of we should be taxing those people, and that's basically the windfall profit tax. And they created the U.S. Synthetic Fuels Corporation, another good move because I actually also work there. So this was sort of a full employment policy for me. But slowly the ideas that had been around forever were becoming law. The big question was, are they really getting us anywhere? Are they improving the situation? Well, the Iranian Revolution not only played havoc with the oil markets, it also played a big role in Jimmy Carter's defeat and victory by President Ronald Reagan. Now, I have to say the difference between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan is about as great as between any two presidents in terms of energy policy. Carter was very much government involvement, you know, the answer was government, and Reagan comes in and he said, markets should drive national energy policy with minimal interference or guidance from the government. He had a very clear vision. And this quote is a little convoluted because some person in the government wrote it, but let me just read it to you. He called for removal of the inconsistency, inefficiency, and uncertainty caused by inherited policy. That would mean Carter's policy. And thereafter to facilitate the operation of market forces as the guiding and disciplining constraint shaping investment, production, and consumption decisions in the energy sector. In other words, he said, enough, government telling us what to do. Let the markets tell. It was a sea change in attitude and in action, and the results were almost immediate. As expected, prices rose and behavior changed. Suddenly, domestic production, which had been going down, in such areas as the Alaskan North Slope, suddenly became financially viable and increased because as the prices went up, a lot of things became possible that had not been possible before. Exploration outside of the OPEC countries also became attractive. Places like the North Sea, just off the coast of England. The higher prices also induced conservation. We know for a fact that if energy costs more, you're going to use less. But don't get too happy because all was not sunshine and roses. Because in 1985 and 1986, the exuberance that people were feeling translated into oversupply, and oversupply caused exceeded demand, and then prices tanked. In essence, the market worked. But the way the market worked, prices went down, and the economy slumped. Dallas, Houston, Denver, any city that had anything to do with oil production was suddenly on the ropes. It was really a horrific time. I was spending a lot of time in those cities during that period, and it was amazing to see the bankruptcies, to see buildings completely empty. Another fatality, which I wasn't too sad about at the time, of these events was OPEC. They didn't know how to act when they weren't in charge. And these lower oil prices and the overproduction had thrown them into disarray. Within 5 years, oil prices dropped from $37 a barrel in 1981 to $14 a barrel in 1986. That was a dramatic change. Obviously, it was good for some people, but our economy just could not accommodate that fast of a shift. At that point, it became clear to many of us that America's energy policy needed to be more flexible and that it couldn't be based on a single scenario. We had been planning as if there would always be supply shortages and always be high prices. Well, what we realized is we needed to have a wider range. We needed to use that Monte Carlo simulation to get the full range of flexibility. Now, a good friend of mine and a colleague from the Department of Energy wrote a book, and it's I think, one of the best books on energy policy. His name is Vito Stagliano, and he and I work together at the Department of Energy. There's a part in his book, if you don't understand this, then you're going to fall victim to a lot of political rhetoric. Vito said this: the great dichotomy of the U.S. energy economy, perhaps among all nations, is that a federal policy to foster economically efficient market-priced oil consumption is antithetical to U.S. oil production. Let me go on. U.S. oil production is dominated by high-cost, marginal wells pumping an average of 13 barrels a day. Now, granted, this is an average. Now, remember that. By contrast, production per well in Saudi Arabia is nearly 7,000 barrels per day. In Iran, it is close to 9,000 barrels a day. He goes on further to compare costs, which are even more startling to me. There's a cost in oil production called lifting cost. And in the U.S., lifting cost is about $13 a barrel. In the Middle East, it runs about $5. So in any race of production and price, the Middle Eastern producers are going to win. We're just not in the money. This is a reality that our energy policy has to come to grips with. If you want it cheap, the U.S. is not going to be your supplier. And so when you hear calls for domestic production, I think it's important to know what the implications are of that. Ronald Reagan was succeeded by his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who proposed his own series of energy initiatives before he too became distracted by yet another war in the Middle East, the first Gulf War. Like his predecessors in the White House, he called for energy independence, making it a priority. And actually in the first Bush administration, there was extensive work to get public input on national energy policy. And actually, I think it educated the public in a whole different way that they had never experienced. So the broad-ranging legislation was proposed that added emphasis to existing policy and some new direction, but by and large, it was more of the same that we had heard from. In 1993, Bill Clinton became president, and I got another job. And the agenda focused on health care, welfare reform, NAFTA, and deficit reduction. Obviously, energy policy was a secondary priority. And this is a very scary thought. I was one of the few people on the White House staff that had any energy experience. But that isn't even what I was doing there. So it gives you a sense of how far down on the list energy was as a priority. Facing a Congress controlled by the opposition party, Clinton's comprehensive energy program never really got traction, and there was no major legislation passed. However, one of the things that happened during the Carter administration had special implications for my business, the business of generating electricity and transmitting it. What happened is they used the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to really promote competition within the electricity industry. And that competition brought us great things like the California energy crisis and other areas. But it definitely, that was one thing that started during the Clinton administration that has had a big impact on in our world. Clinton also enthusiastically supported ethanol production and an array of other green sources as well as conservation. One of the interesting themes through this whole study is that ethanol is not my favorite fuel substitute, but it definitely has long played a role in our energy fuel mix simply because it's a political win. The Midwestern states, the big corn producers have seen this as a means to have an alternative use for their crops. But that has been consistent throughout every president, and I think it's more for political reasons, not less for the fact that it's really a good energy alternative. Actually, Clinton, as Nixon did years before, he formed this group with the automobile manufacturers to try to really create some new advanced technology, hybrids, hydrogen fuel cell cars, and actually that is being built on even today. So Clinton didn't have a lot of impact, but there were certain key things that started during that administration. Clinton's successor was George W. Bush. Now, the urgency of energy considerations became really quickly apparent to Bush because it was soon after he became president that there were a series of blackouts in California. You know, it's the worst president's worst dream to have domestic disasters like that and realize that policy was going to have to be created. What he did is he formed a special task force headed by Vice President Cheney to develop energy policy. And one of the things that came out of that task force is they said the United States is at a point in time where it is more vulnerable to oil supply disruption than it was in the 70s with the first Arab oil embargo. That's a pretty telling statement. Basically, the task force got to work and they produced policies that were very much supply side oriented. They wanted to include incentives and access to oil production sites. And as you probably have heard, the whole development of oil in the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve, ANWR, that was part of the proposal. Also, they included very strong incentives for advanced nuclear reactor development. I mean, that is one place that this administration has been very supportive of our line of work. There were a lot of incentives for clean coal technology, as well as a real drive to move this nation closer to using hydrogen as a fuel source. Now, Bush also supported the continued competition in the electricity sector. Last summer, Congress responded by passing the first comprehensive energy legislation since 1992. And that was a good bill. And I think if any of you listened to President Bush speak last week in his State of the Union, he went over a lot of the things that I've mentioned about the need for technology, how we can solve our problems using technological advancements. So I think that we have made some progress, and I would say that we've come a long way since 1917. We've come 99 years since President Wilson formed the Fuel Administration. But I think it's fair to ask, so what have we learned? And what are we using those lessons? Are we putting them to work? Well, I can only share my view, and the good news is that it's not too long. But if I had to pick one administration, and this it kills part of my soul as a good Democrat to say this, but I think if I had to pick one administration's energy policy as saying if I had to have one today, the one I would adopt, it would be Richard Nixon's. The things I liked about it was balanced, it was comprehensive, which I think it's key to a successful policy. It called for incentives and programs to encourage a diversity of fuels. And it matched it with a healthy budget. You know, I have heard a lot of people get up and talk beautifully about, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to be on the road toward energy independence. Well, but then they don't provide any money to pay the tolls. It doesn't help if you don't put your money where your mouth is. Nixon policy also recognized the essential role that demand-side behavior plays in our energy picture. He called for every sector to reduce energy consumption. And he didn't care whether you did it by achieving greater efficiency or whether you just changed your behavior. I think this two-pronged energy and demand and supply approach is necessary. Now, Nixon also was one of the first people to link energy policy to environmental policy. When he called for EPA to do the study on SO2 emissions from coal plants, people should have picked up on that. It was a great idea. And it should have proceeded, but that is not how it's been happening. I think that the parallel development of energy and environmental policy, they're done in silos. They're mutually exclusive from each other by and large. The committees in Congress are different. The people who develop the concepts are different, but yet they're so interrelated. When I was working at the Department of Energy, one of the things that shocked me was how antagonistic we were to EPA and they were to us. We should have been working in lockstep. We should have understood the implications of energy policy for environmental policy and vice versa. There's a growing base of evidence, and scientific discoveries have enhanced our understanding of how important the link is between environment and energy. I want to tell you that you have a lot to be proud of, because a lot of the technology that I think we need for energy is developed right in this community. University of Tennessee, Oak Ridge National Laboratory are two of the most well-regarded sources of energy-related research and technology. But I want to get back to my whole view of the Nixon policy. Sadly, one of the biggest problems about his situation was that he couldn't carry the day. He did not have the political clout. And I don't care how good your ideas are. In Washington, if you don't have the juice, you don't have the ability to win the day. For the best policy to be effective, it has to be sustainable. And this is one thing that I have seen over these 7 administrations. As administrations change, everybody feels like they have to put their own imprint on policy. And they feel like that they have to, reinvent the wheel, even though the wheel that they have is already working. These are problems, and I think to be successful, energy policy that is working has to be sustainable, and we have to keep true to this. So on the supply side, I think it's important that we must depend on a very diverse fuel mix. It's got to be hydro, nuclear, wind, solar. It has to be the whole menu. It must include a demand side component, conservation and greater efficiency. It must reflect the joint consideration of environment and energy. It must have adequate funding. It must employ the very latest technology and include adequate support for research, development, demonstration, and deployment of new technology. And to be meaningful, a new policy has to be sustained over time. This is not easy, or somebody would have already done it. But one of the things I think it's our responsibility to do is to be informed, to be active. And each of you are going to have a role in the future, and you have a role right now, to make people aware of their own energy consumption and to speak out to policymakers and let them know that it's important to you that this country have the benefit of a wise, sound, and strong energy policy. And I hope that these ideas and somewhat my irreverent attitude has helped you see how we've gotten to where we are today and what may be possible to lead us to a better place in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay. Ms. Harris will entertain questions and comments from the audience now. Hannah.
You think in future, when we, if the price for the gas continue increasing, we will be able, or the government be willing to forget about that money or taxes they making more on the gas and depend on our country to develop to get the gas from?
I can't project into the future, but no one has been willing to do that to date. I mean, when you ask government to forego revenue, especially as the deficit has gotten so huge recently. I would not see that happening now based on past performance. I don't know. I mean, I don't know where the political will is to make the sacrifices necessary. I don't know. That's been part of the problem in our energy policy. People want it all without paying for it.
Any other questions or comments? Jack?
I think that the statement you made where the environment and energy have not been linked in the past is completely true. It was striking in many of those presidencies that you talked about that the climate change issue very seldom got linked to energy and all of that. But now I think we're seeing the point where that is being recognized, and any of the energy choices that we're looking at now has to pass through a screen about what does it mean for climate change. And I think that's a big sea change, and will be a big influence in the kind of choices we make in technologies in the future.
Well, but that policy has not been formalized in this administration.
No, it may have to wait till the next administration. You're right.
I'm just, it's just one of those realities that you're right. But I think, you know what, increasingly Republicans and Democrats share a view that global climate change is actually legitimate, but that has been very slow to come.
Professor Bose?
Spoken by someone who used to work for Al Gore. I've known about it for quite a while.
Okay, I think one real problem is that our reserve of the fossil fuels are limited. It has been projected that even with the coal, we'll exhaust it in around 200 years. So
200 years is a pretty good time period for me.
Okay, but the rate of energy consumption is going on at the 1,000 times than the rate of energy formation. So a time will come when all our resources will be finished.
That's right.
So therefore, the renewable energy resources are extremely important, like some European countries are putting in, but in the United States, we don't have that much of emphasis. There is some emphasis, but not adequate. So my point is that even with efficient energy consumptions, it will not be sufficient to supply our energy resources. So what are we going to do in future, maybe 100, 200 years or something like that?
Well, I don't think I'm going to have to worry about it 200 years from now. But what we're doing right now is we're restarting a nuclear reactor that's been mothballed for 17 years. We see near-term nuclear energy. This will be our 6th reactor. And we see that as, and I'm not just saying that because I'm here, because I think Lee will tell you that's what I really believe. It's got to play a bigger part in our energy use. Renewables, TVA has a very small renewables program. Almost 1% of our power. That's out of about 33,000 megawatts. Not quite 1% is renewable energy. It's just not, for us, a good base load option. What we need is base load, that load that you never turn off. And, typically renewable energy is more intermittent than this base load plant that just churns day in and day out. And that's a problem for a company like TVA that has to keep the lights on. So I don't know if renewable is truly going to be an answer for utilities.
Can I make another comment here?
Okay.
That is the reason the concept of hydrogen economy
Both.
is coming up.
That's right, hydrogen economy, but there are problems with that.
No. The main concept is that the world has huge resources of wind energy. Mm-hmm. So convert wind energy and generate hydrogens and store that and use that hydrogen as a fuel. So here it solves the problem. It's very expensive. There's a lot of problems to be solved.
I'm glad it's not going to be done in my watch. Yeah.
Do we have other comments or questions? Lillian?
Lillian, I appreciate my friends coming to hear me today.
Well, if you listen to the State of the Union message, you heard a lot of talk about energy and plans and all, but when you got down into the budget numbers, it wasn't there.
Wasn't there.
And I think people have expectations that we're going to be doing research, and it's not
No.
going to happen.
I mean, this is what I was talking about. I mean, you know, I don't want your rhetoric. What I want is money to show that you're serious. And it, you know, it sort of angers me when people get credit for beautiful language and beautiful message, but there's no there. And it didn't surprise me when I looked at the budget and saw that there was no there. As a matter of fact, they're cutting spending in some of the areas. And, you know, this is not directed simply to President Bush, because this happens all the time. This is not the first time this has ever happened in Washington, D.C. So, but I agree. It's, you know, somewhere we've got to hold people accountable, and we have to let them know that this is important to us. Because until, you know, right now we go from crisis to crisis to crisis. Now, unfortunately, with the disruption and the unsettled period of time in the Middle East, those disruptions are coming on a more regular basis. So, I mean, is that how we're going to sustain energy policy? I would hope not.
Let me ask the final question. You mentioned green power during your presentation. Is it TVA or KUB that has the green power switch where you can buy?
That it's a joint project
Okay.
with our TVA. We actually have the green generation. Our distributors sell it.
Okay.
And so you can, if you have your own home here, subscribe and buy a block of green power. Basically what that says is green power is more expensive than almost any other, except now natural gas may be more expensive, but green power, you're buying a block actually supports offsetting the extra cost of the green power generation. Yeah.
Thanks for making those comments, but my question has to do with the definition of green power. I was going to buy some.
Yep.
And then I realized that their definition of green power did not include nuclear power. And we're
That's right.
all aware of the environmental advantages of nuclear power. Why is it green power, why doesn't it include nuclear power as well as
Our
the
green
others?
power program is certified, which a lot of people want it to be certified. We have a lot of commercial clients who buy green power, and it's certified by a institution foundation in California, and they do not consider nuclear. So I suggest you direct your question to that institution.
All right, very good answer. Thank you very much. As most of you know, maybe some of you don't know, we do have a reception downstairs, and we do have a few new faces in the audience. Seems like we have new faces every week, and everyone is invited. And Ms. Harris will be down there to answer questions 101.
I have
But-
CDs of my speech now.
But before we adjourn, let's express our appreciation again to Skila for her presentation. Thank you. Excellent presentation.